Welcome to the last and final installment of our It's No Trouble at All series that we've been going through Liberty Hill on Wednesday nights, addressing some challenges leveled by an atheist claiming that these are things which would cause trouble in church. You may notice that this session is different than the others due to some unforeseen issues. We were unable to use the recording from the actual Wednesday night class, and so I am re-recording this. I hope you enjoy it. So with no further ado, let's jump right on in and have a look at the case made why this should cause trouble in church.
This is the million-dollar question, and this is the last one. The evidence we have in the New Testament could exist even if Jesus didn't rise from the dead in bodily form. This question takes a lot of thought. Now, I think the knee-jerk reaction for most Christians is to strongly disagree with this. The evidence we have in the New Testament could exist even if Jesus didn't rise from the dead in bodily form. A lot of Christians say, no, that's impossible. How we got all these eyewitness accounts, blah, 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 blah. No, we wouldn't have the evidence we have if Jesus didn't rise from the dead in bodily form. But before you have that knee-jerk response, I want you to consider a few things. Our very first records of Jesus are from the authentic letters of Paul. By the way, if you weren't aware, most scholars say that 6 of the 13 letters of Paul are forgeries. I know you don't like the word forgery. You can call it use pseudonyms, use different names. But Paul, in the authentic letters, never uses these words: Pilate, Mary and Joseph, Joseph of Arimathea, Judas, John the Baptist, tomb. Paul never uses the word tomb. Nazareth, Galilee, Bethlehem. And Paul does not mention Jesus' virgin birth, his healings or exorcisms, or just having a ministry in general, or the events leading up to his death, like the tomb narrative and so forth that we find in the Gospels. So I put this in here because it's sort of like that what's more likely question. You know how you've heard the 7 last sayings of Jesus? Every gospel has like a different last thing Jesus said just before he died. And so the question is, well, what is more likely, that Jesus actually said these things, or that an author used the Old Testament to say what Jesus said? Basically, using the Old Testament to put words in the mouth of Jesus. So in Luke, it says, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." Whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke was quite familiar with the Old Testament and was familiar with this psalm and used this line, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." Now, I realize Christians will say, no, this is just showing the consistency of how God works from the Old Testament to the New. But what's more likely? In Mark 15, it says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then shortly, I think he drinks refuses some vinegar and then dies. But this is basically the last word. Now, what's more likely, that Jesus actually said that, or that the author of Mark used Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, the reason why I ask what's more likely is because notice, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." It's resignation. It's like, and then he dies. Whereas Mark is saying, "Why have you forsaken me?" It's not like resignation. It's not acceptance. It's like, it's giving a very different attitude. So did these things happen in history, or did these authors use Old Testament verses to create a narrative? And again, showing that these accounts that we do have of Jesus, Mark, the book of Mark was probably open while Matthew and Luke wrote, and the book of Matthew was probably open when Luke wrote, and so they are borrowing heavily from each other. Now, and remember, the context of this is all to ask the question, could we have the evidence we have if Jesus didn't rise from the dead? And also keep in mind that could we have the evidence we have knowing that the dates of when they were written, most people who could say otherwise would have been dead? And a lot of scholars believe that the Gospels were written in either Greece or Italy, 1,000 miles away from the purported events. Could we have the evidence we have without Jesus really rising from the dead in bodily form? So I want to end with this challenge. And the challenge is, besides Paul, can you name one person who states their name and where they're from? Because remember, they didn't have last names back then. And so usually they say, hi, I'm Doug from, and they'd state where they're from. So can you name one person who identifies themselves, their name, where they're from, that wrote in their own words that they saw a bodily risen Jesus? And now this is besides Paul, because Paul says he did, but it's through revelation and visions. And when you're considering answering that challenge, remember that neither the evangelists nor the first readers engaged in historical analysis. Their aim was to confirm Christian faith. Scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after. Remember, the average lifespan is only 45 years. Thus, they do not present eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teachings.
So the question is, if the resurrection did not happen, could the New Testament documents still have been written? I think it's important that we ask ourselves, why is it that these documents were written? I mean, what was the motivation? What was going on? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to address that. I'm going to go through and address the individual claims being made by Doug in this video. So why would they write? Well, there's basically three options. Either it really did happen, it's false, it never did happen, but they really believed it did. Or three, they just made the whole thing up. And so we need to kind of examine this. But notice one option I did not put, but I think that Doug may have in mind, and that's that there's some kind of non-physical resurrection. Some people put forward the idea that Paul is not talking about a bodily physical resurrection. However, the claim in the Bible is that it was a bodily physical resurrection. Christianity is rooted in Judaism, and on their theological framework, there is no real space allowed for this kind of ghostly resurrection. Resurrection means a physical body. And Paul says that we will be like Christ, that we're going to have these resurrection bodies that are like Christ's bodies. And the Greek word used is soma, and it's a reference to the physical body. There are Greek words for spirit or vision or some kind of immaterial entity that could have been used, but those words are not what was used. And the Greek word that is used for resurrection, I believe anastasi, if I'm pronouncing that right, almost always means a physical return from the dead. So just put it out of your mind, any notion that Paul is teaching a spiritual resurrection, that these later authors and just invented this physical resurrection based on what Paul said. It was only and always ever a physical resurrection in bodily form. Now first, let's take a look at these challenges, and then I'm going to give why I think the New Testament could not have been written apart from the resurrection. First, he asks, could we have the writings of Paul? Would we have the writings of Paul? And he points out that Paul does not use the words. Remember, in reference to the resurrection, Paul does not use the words Pilate, Mary and Joseph, Joseph of Arimathea, Judas, John the Baptist's tomb, Nazareth, Galilee, or Bethlehem. And Paul does not mention the virgin birth, Jesus' healings, his exorcisms, ministry events leading up to Jesus' death. Well, okay. And what? Well, what's the point you're trying to get at? So what? Paul doesn't mention these things. You seem to think that he should have, that if the resurrection, these events in the Gospels actually happened, then therefore Paul should have mentioned these things. But why? Why should he have? He's writing pastoral letters. Okay, these are not historical biographies. He's not writing some kind of dissertation on the events of the life of Jesus. Most of the time, he is addressing specific issues that specific church is going through. And what's interesting is there's already an assumed background knowledge in his letters. So he doesn't have to mention them. Second, Paul teaches a bodily resurrection. So what would be the contention then if there had really been no resurrection? That never happened, so what, he made it up? Right? That he was a true believer, but he was mistaken? Well, it's possible. There's this framework that we're going to examine this through. There's what's possible, but that's a broad thing. Technically, anything's possible if it's not logically contradictory. Like a square circle is not possible. A married bachelor is not possible. Anything that's logical can be possible, but not everything that's possible makes sense. Not everything that's possible is plausible as an explanation. But then not everything that makes sense is actually likely to be true. And so you have to go from possible to plausible to probable. So let's take a look at that. So could Paul have just made it up? Well, possible. But is it plausible? Remember, Paul is a promising, intelligent, devoted Jew. He's a Pharisee. And all of a sudden he switches from persecuting Christians to being a successful evangelist for a fictional religion that earns him beatings and persecution and ultimately death. Does that seem very plausible? It doesn't seem very plausible to me. Okay, well, maybe he believed it, but he was just wrong. Well, most scholars agree, let's go ahead and use Doug's cherished line there, that Paul had some kind of experience, that this drastic shift had a trigger, and that trigger was on the road to Damascus. Now, Paul claims there's an encounter with the resurrected Christ, and his Jewish theology at the time did not include a merely spiritual resurrection. Resurrection was physical, so if he is wrong about this experience, it is far more plausible that he would fall back on his Jewish beliefs and rationalize what happened to him within that framework. If he is so zealous, so just devoted to his cause that he is arresting Christians, having them beaten, and gleefully approved of the stoning of Stephen, he is a level of commitment that does not easily shake. So this whole thing where he was just a true believer, no, I'm thinking that's not very plausible either. Well, they don't pass muster as plausible, so obviously it wouldn't be very probable, right? Is it probable that Paul would have made all this stuff up, that he would have written these things with no resurrection? No, I don't think it's probable at all. Right? There would be no letters from Paul without a resurrection, because there would be no Paul without the resurrection. Paul would still be Saul, and he would be a Pharisee climbing the ladder in his organization. Next, he gives this examples of some things, kind of a, did Jesus really say this? And he points out in Luke 23, where Jesus says, into your hands I commit my spirit, quoting Psalm 31:5. And he mentions Mark 15, where Jesus says, why have you forsaken me, quoting Psalm 22. And he points these out, and he says apparently they're conflicting comments. But there's no reason for them to be conflicting. Jesus was on the cross for several hours. Okay, plenty of time for him to say both things, plenty of time for him to say all 7 things that are recorded in the Gospels. And so different authors focus on different things to show Christ in the certain way that they were addressing their gospel. That they included or excluded different sayings doesn't really matter. So he asks, what's more likely? That Jesus said these things, or that someone put these Old Testament words into the mouth of Jesus? Well, he gives a plausible explanation, right? That God was showing the consistency between the Old Testament and the New Testament, which he then just waves away with no explanation. Well, here's another possible explanation. Jesus knew the Old Testament, and he said these things specifically to bring ideas to mind that he wanted to remind people of. In Psalm 31, the whole passage, it says, in you, O Lord, I put my trust. Let me never be ashamed. Deliver me in your righteousness. Bow down your ear to me. Deliver me speedily. Be my rock of refuge, a fortress of defense to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress. Therefore, for your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Pull me out of the net which they have secretly laid for me. For you are my strength. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, God of truth. I mean, that's some pretty blatant gospel preaching right there. It's very, very possible that he said this, that he's quoting, and the purpose is because he knows what his disciples are going to be going through, and that this would be a psalm of encouragement to them. Also in Psalm 22, right, it starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But what's interesting is you look further down in that psalm, and it describes the situation. It describes the crucifixion. Hundreds of years before crucifixion had even been invented. Verse 14, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death, for dogs have surrounded me. Dogs, that is the Jewish way of viewing Gentiles. Dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So he points to Psalms, and it describes exactly what he's going through. So Doug didn't really offer any argument here. He just puts forth the idea and says, what's more likely? Well, I don't know, Doug, what is more likely? The assertion here seems to be that it's more likely that this was made up and the words were put in Jesus' mouth. An alternate explanation, however, is not a refutation. I mean, you set this out here and you say, oh, well, they just put these words in Jesus' mouth. Any proof for that? As Christopher Hitchens was fond of saying, anything that's asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Okay, so let's look at it. Is it possible? Well, of course, anything's possible. Is it plausible? And I'm going to say no, for the same reason I'm going to say no to his next point that we're going to get to in a minute. Most of the New Testament authors and the apostles were killed for their teaching. If the claim is that they just made this stuff up in order to get persecuted, ostracized, beaten, and killed, then no. No, it's not very plausible that the apostles and the New Testament authors are just making stuff up. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose by this course of action. That level of commitment to a known fraud is highly implausible. So I don't think it's even plausible that they are going to make up details about this supposed crucifixion and resurrection. Is it very probable? I'm going to say no, it's not probable. I think it's very likely that Jesus, whose entire ministry and teaching are saturated with Old Testament quotes and language, that he uttered some Old Testament references from the cross. Why would that be unlikely? That seems very likely. He's a Jewish rabbi. He's going to say some things. Why wouldn't they be profound and from the scriptures? He was up there long enough to say multiple things and to do so in varying emotional expressions. In the video, he makes the point that one is like, into your hands I commit my spirit. Oh, like it's a release. But then another one, it's, why have you forsaken me? Well, first, I don't know if it was that kind of bipolar reaction going on there, but hey, you're up there for a few hours, you got time to have different emotions. No issue there at all. Next, he goes into this example of how the gospel authors seem to have copied one another. But this is a non-issue to me. All right, so Luke used Matthew or Mark as a source. Okay, so Luke tells us that he uses sources. So Matthew or Mark copied from the other. Okay. There's all kinds of reasons why you might copy from someone else, why you might use someone else's writing. Maybe they like the other guy's recounting better, and they decided not to just reinvent the wheel. Maybe they didn't have as good a memory of the event, so they just took the other guy's account for their own. Maybe they're using a scribe, and just for ease, rather than retelling it, they just said, hey, you use his version. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. You don't know. And so to sit there and go, aha, they copied, therefore there's a problem here. Well, there's no reason for there to be a problem there. That is inventing something. And actually, something someone mentioned along these lines who teaches this stuff, and I'm trying to remember the guy's name, but I don't. I'm very sorry. But it's a good point he makes. He says, there is nothing embarrassing about Matthew and Luke using Mark. In fact, it is a testimony to the antiquity, distribution, and accepted authority of Mark's gospel. And then Matthew and Luke expand on it with their own sources, interviews, and experience. So the fact that they're copying is actually an attestation to the reliability of this account and the truthfulness of these events. It's not a hampering for it. Plus, the really interesting bit is the differences. Each gospel has material that the others do not. And the details that they do give on shared stories actually differ slightly enough, and they corroborate each other with their interconnectedness. Undesigned coincidences, we've taught on that before. It's fabulous evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Okay, the next thing, right? That they are long gone. That these accounts, the disciples and any dissenting eyewitnesses would probably have been dead by the time that the Gospels were written. Now he's going off of a dating that says the very earliest that any of the Gospels would have been written would have been at least 40 years later and 1,000 miles away. Okay, well, as has been argued elsewhere, I think that the dating is actually that you have the first three Gospels within about 30 years after the death and resurrection of Christ, and then most of the New Testament writings are actually finished within a few short decades. And they were widely circulated, regardless of where they were written. So, okay, something may have been written in Israel, but guess what? It's being copied and spread around. So it's not all that weird of a thing that the distance would be an issue, as we'll see in a minute. But let's say that he's right, and the Gospels were written much later by people who were not there. This is an even more unbelievable scenario. See, the popular dates for the Gospels are late 1st century into the early 2nd century. They put them being written during a time of intense persecution. Emperor Nero started persecuting the Christians in 64 AD, and the emperor that followed him, I can't pronounce it, it starts with a D, actually kind of ramped up persecution. So while you can maybe find some believability in the claim that some misguided fiction following on the heels of Jesus' death, not foreseeing the persecution, like maybe the disciples kind of made it up, but they didn't know what was coming. Okay, the idea that these people later on, during the midst of persecution, are going to make this stuff up, no, sorry, that does not pass muster. That is something that I am going to flat out say is not plausible in the least bit. And he makes this comment about the distance. Well, they're 1,000 miles away. What's interesting is they're too far away for these things to be checked on. Right? He's saying people could not possibly have known this. They were too far away. They weren't in Israel. They were 1,000 miles away from where the events took place. So it's too far to check on details, but it's not too far away to make copies of one another, because the people are spread all over the place. Matthew probably wrote in Israel. Mark was in Rome. Luke was probably in Asia in his travels with Paul when he was writing. So, okay, they're not too spread out to be able to copy from one another, but they're too spread out to know what they're talking about. Sorry, that just doesn't add up. Lastly, he makes this challenge where he goes, I challenge, name one person besides Paul who wrote their own words that they saw the bodily risen Jesus, that they signed their name to their writing. Of course, the idea here is that there are none, supposedly. There is one. I actually skimmed through the letters of the New Testament that do tell us who they are, and as far as making a clear statement of the resurrection, Peter. We have Peter. Okay, now first off, we don't need Peter. There are plenty of historical events taken as fact that only have one source. So this demand for someone else is kind of hollow. But if you insist, we do have Peter. Right, in 1 Peter 1:1, he announces himself. I am Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. 1 Peter 3, 1 Peter 1:20, 21, 1 Peter 3:21, he mentions the resurrection and having seen Jesus raised from the dead. 2 Peter 1:1, he announces himself as Simon Peter, bondservant and apostle of Jesus Christ. And he points out in 2 Peter 1:16, we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. And just as an interesting addendum to that, 2 Peter 3:15-16, he mentions that Paul's writings, he refers to Paul's writings as Scripture. He gives the stamp of Holy Scripture on the writings of Paul. So that's a pretty good case for what's going on there. So challenge accepted and met. But notice, he posed the challenge of being able to have the evidence of the New Testament without Jesus having actually raised from the dead. And he didn't actually build an argument to support it. He just rattles off some stuff to create doubt. Nothing that he says here adds up to the New Testament being written without the resurrection. But it's a bunch of stuff that's going to kind of maybe create someone who doesn't know, isn't really thinking more than a little superficial on these issues, to kind of wonder, right? And this is why he thinks these things would cause trouble in church. Now, I can only guess at this point of what his argument is because he tends to shy away from making declarative propositions. See, Paul did not see a physical Jesus. Is this his point, that Paul did not see a physical Jesus and doesn't talk about a bodily resurrection and that the Gospels are made up later? Well, if it's made up, the story of Jesus' life, ministry, death, resurrection would have been invented during the late 1st and 2nd centuries, as already said. We see pretty well established church by the 3rd century, so it would have needed time to form and to spread. But the late and 1st century and 2nd century are a pretty horrific time of persecution for Christians. This is the fed to lions, crucified, and lit on fire time period. It's not exactly a warm and friendly environment for trying to cash in on some new religion that you just made up. Okay. So, to really address the issue, could we get the New Testament without the resurrection? Is it possible? Well, nearly anything is possible. Yeah, so technically, yes. Is it plausible? Well, not everything that's possible makes sense. He probably thinks that it's plausible, but I disagree. Right? He picks these certain examples and he looks at them individually, and individually they all fail. And also they all fail together. See, but here's the thing. It doesn't matter because history doesn't work this way. Real life is complex and complicated, and events and people are interconnected. History records life, and therefore history is no different. It's complex, it's interconnected. So the means by which he is trying to claim that this is plausible is inherently flawed. So he's trying to make the case that the New Testament could have been written without the resurrection, but the method he's going about it doesn't actually get you to where he's trying to go. So is it probable? Right? I don't think it's even plausible, but let's say it is. Let's be generous. Even though something may be plausible, doesn't mean it's likely. So even if we grant his points, let's be very generous and grant his points. Right? The farthest that's going to get us is that it is plausible explanation that the New Testament could happen even without the resurrection. But that doesn't actually tell you that it did happen without the resurrection. Simply does not have the heft to get it over this last hump to be considered as likely to be true. So even if we grant that it's a sensible account that he's weaving, there's nothing here that makes it to where we should believe that. Now, my counter argument here about the New Testament without the resurrection can't happen. The resurrection is the spark that lit the fuse for the church. If there's no resurrection, there's no church, and nobody is writing any of this at all. I mean, the writings by the disciples. Okay, this resurrected Messiah notion is highly unlikely to be invented. Jews at the times did not see this as the Messiah's role. All throughout the Gospels, is it described as they demonstrate their lack of understanding. Jesus will flat out tell them, I have to die. And they're confused about it. They don't know what he's talking about. They're too scared to ask. And they had nothing to gain by creating this idea, and they had everything to lose. What are they going to get? Power and control? People like to say religion is just a means to control the people. Control who? What are they getting control of? Are they trying to get money? Where are they getting this money from? By all accounts, they didn't die rich and happy. They get kicked out of synagogues. They get beaten and jailed and killed. Right? So if there's not actually something going on here, it's very, very unlikely that the disciples are making up this story. What about the writings of Paul? Well, Paul was a devoted Pharisee. He was climbing the ladder in his social group, in his organization. Right? He converted after the church had already started. So if there's no church, there's no Paul. Well, there's no resurrection. There's no church to persecute. If there's no resurrection, there's no encounter on the road to Damascus because he's not out and about persecuting Christians. If there is no church, Saul never becomes Paul. Doesn't happen. Okay, let's imagine that it is these later authors. I don't believe they are, but let's say they are. Well, the later Christians are writing stuff. There are no later Christians if there is no church. Well, okay, so maybe they aren't, following in the footsteps of an earlier church body that created. Maybe they're making it up at that time. Well, again, for what gain? They have the same problem as the first disciples would have. They're not going to come up with it. They're Jewish background doesn't naturally lend to a resurrected, dying Messiah. They're going to create a new religion in order to what? Be persecuted, beaten, jailed, and killed? It just does not pass muster. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, there is no church. There's no reason to invent it, and every reason to abandon it, even if they did. Even if they said, hey guys, let's come up with this Messiah figure. Let's say he rose from the dead and go preach this and start a church and we'll be in charge and it'll be great. Well, guess what? It doesn't go so great. They would have every reason to abandon it if it were a fraud. So if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then Christianity should have died with him on the cross. So again, you don't get a New Testament without a church. You don't get a church without a resurrection. The fact is that the disciples had sincere resurrection experiences. Virtually all scholars agree on this. They experienced something, and without this experience, we would have no church. So what is it that they experienced? Well, there's what's called the minimal facts argument. Right? It's this idea that there are some let's just push all this other stuff aside, look at the basic historical effects that are agreed on by scholars. And those facts would include some very basic things like Jesus lived, Jesus died, Jesus was buried, he was seen again later by claimed to be seen later again by his disciples, who then were willing to face persecution and death to defend that claim. But some people may say, well, okay, but look, miracles are way less probable. I mean, miracles by their very nature, they're rare, and therefore they're the least likely explanation. But being less common does not mean they're any less plausible or any less probable. Right? You need to actually examine the specific case to determine this. This idea that miracles are automatically to be considered less likely seems to be like a bias-driven restriction. This is not honest truth-seeking. Well, but if you want to prove a miracle happened, like a resurrection, extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. Well, no, you don't need extraordinary evidence. You just need any old kind of evidence to support two things. One, that he was dead, and two, then he wasn't dead. You don't need extraordinary evidence. You just need regular old evidence pointing to those two things. And we have this handful of very basic facts, which virtually all scholars are going to agree on, that Jesus was crucified, that he was buried, and many days and weeks after his death, people have sincerely reported experiences with a resurrected Jesus. Now, these experiences are then the motivation behind their bold proclamation of this new faith. So without these sincere resurrection experiences, there is no church. And without the church, there is no New Testament. So we know that these experiences happen. What's the best explanation for these experiences? Well, just a few quick ones that are kind of the common ones offered. Maybe as a hallucination. No, groups don't share hallucinations. Hallucinations are something very specific to individuals. Well, they just made it up. Well, there's no motives. It's foreign to their existing framework regarding the Messiah. They have nothing to gain, everything to lose, and most of them die horrible deaths. There's no record of anyone recanting. Some say, well, it was a mistaken identity. It was someone passing themselves off as Jesus. Well, that's not very likely. We're talking about people who lived with Jesus day in and day out for 3 years. You think they don't recognize him? Well, maybe he had a twin. There's no evidence of a twin. Not to mention that among those who converted and believed that Christ was the Messiah were some of his own family. His brother James, and I believe Jude, his brother of Jesus, wrote books in the Bible proclaiming him as the Messiah. That's not a mistaken identity. I say, well, it was a conspiracy, right? It was just this plot to make it up and to do this. Well, here's the thing. Conspiracies, they need few people. In order for a conspiracy to be successful, you need the smallest number of people and the least amount of pressure. Here you have a large number of people that would have been involved in the conspiracy in a high, intense pressure situation and persecution. So conspiracy is not very likely. And then my favorite is the swoon theory, that somehow Jesus did not die of his injuries on the cross and he later recovered, and so there was no resurrection, which is just ridiculous. Crucifixion kills, okay? And even had he survived, the absurd notion that even had he survived the beating that he took before the crucifixion and the crucifixion itself, and being stabbed in the side with a spear, he would not be able to do the things that he does. He comes and goes among the disciples, where he's seen walking on the road to Emmaus, and he takes a trip to Galilee and cooks breakfast for the disciples. I mean, this is not the acts of someone who has undergone recently, all this within like the span of a month. Okay, he's going to be months in recovery. So that does not work. The only actual explanation that fits is a real resurrection. It's the only thing that fits the internal evidence and that is free of the external baggage. Unless you bring this baggage to it yourself based on existing bias against resurrection probability. So again, if there's no resurrection, there's no church. If there's no church, there's no New Testament. And the only explanation that fits the evidence well is that there actually was a resurrection. And so, no, there is no trouble being caused on this issue. Thank you for tuning into this, for bearing with me going through this series. You can find links to other installments and sessions of this study, as well as other things along this same line at heypastor.org or at Liberty Hill Baptist Church's website, lhbcmoody.org. Have a wonderful day. God bless.